Support and tax relief for entrepreneurs and small businesses is proposed. Incentives for industry are strengthened, including funding for special economic zones. Nearly 500,000 subsistence and smallholder farmers will receive training and financial support from the budget.
Well, still with us in studio, Mike Schusler, Chief Economist at economist.co.za, Emil Brincker, Director at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, and Rob Price, Market Strategist at ETM Analytics. Well, we were chatting about small businesses and small business relief, and I think you wanted to add something to that, Mike.
Yeah, I think that the fact is that they have taken from 6% to 5% the turnover tax, which is a good thing, but the problem is the rate stays at $1 million. Now, if you look at some industries, there's no net profit of 4% or 5% even. So if you tax those small guys who typically got even less of a net rate, 5%, that is a problem. So what we need to do is we need to lift up that tax threshold in the first place or that turnover threshold, to say 2 or 3 million, and then apply a thing where you can get the first 600,000 or so free on the turnover, because we're talking turnover, not the profits or anything that people make. And under those circumstances, then you can have it a bit, spread out, and it would be a great help. And the other thing is, I don't think it's only that you need to look at small businesses. You need to look at the whole tax structure on business in South Africa, because I think where other countries beat us is not with a tax rate, but with the tax breaks. And I think government's got to get its head around that very quickly, because we are in a competitive environment.
What do you make of that, the fact that we're possibly not using our fiscal policy more effectively to boost our competitiveness on a global scale?
Well, I think that one should also have a look at the more specifics. For instance, the one example is the REIT legislation. Now, that comes, for instance, over the last 18 months, etc. That was, and if you look at the result, that really boosted the property sector, etc., etc. And if you look at the announcements today, that's really the finalization of that chapter. So I don't think one should just say it's difficult, etc., etc. And from that perspective, then the government is not succeeding. One should give credit in those type of circumstances. And the REIT legislation is a good example, because if you compare that to international precedent, we're really in a good space and we can compete with international companies.
I'd like to ask you, because the Minister did say that they're committed to providing more policy certainty for domestic and foreign investors in South Africa. At the same time, he also delayed the carbon tax from 2015 to 2016.
Yes.
And I should imagine that creates more uncertainty for business in the country.
Well, on the other hand, it also gives an opportunity for business to make representations, because if you look at the Australian example, you don't want it to be introduced and then abolished. It's also important from that perspective, look at everybody and look at the consequences, because especially if you look at the ESCOMs, all those type of entities, if they have to pay that, it's just going to increase and you're going to reflect that in electricity price. So rather take more time, look at that, and then introduce whatever you want to, because the one example, for instance, they said if they introduce that, part of that tax will actually be used in order to fund the renewable energy projects.
Yeah. And looking at boosting confidence amongst the investor community, Rob, let's look at the new Promotion and Protection of Investment Bill. I mean, it entrenches the rights of all investors, he says, ensuring property rights, for example, are protected. I mean, what sense do you get from investors out there about how comfortable, how reassured they're feeling with this now in place?
Well, I mean, there's definitely positive impacts to that, and it's good that the finance minister is moving in that direction. But just looking at the kind of an overall theme in that respect, it would be great if the finance minister, rather than, well, one of the themes that I see in the budget, and we've seen it over many years, is that they try to alleviate poverty rather than maybe targeting the root causes and how they could generate the environment that would create jobs to really take away that poverty, rather than just subsidizing through welfare. And I mean, coming back to the investment, I think that business people would be really encouraged if the tax rates on saving were dropped as well, to encourage people to save and invest in long-term economic growth activity, because I think that is where we maybe go wrong in this country. We look at the short-term ways to try and alleviate poverty rather than actually targeting long-term economic growth. And I think, as I said, the major tool that they could use in that respect is to actually encourage capital creation and saving. And I think the investment community is still a little bit hesitant in that respect because the government hasn't targeted that specific point.
Mike, I ask a question because it's, yes, capital saving and creation as well, but you've also got to look at capital spend, and you've got to boost confidence in order for those purse strings to be loosened by a private sector.
Well, absolutely, and I think he's realised, and I think government has realised, that they need to spend more on capital in the last few years, and it's been a continuous theme. In fact, he keeps saying he spends more on capital than on expenditure, but he's obviously then including state-owned enterprises expenditure on capital, but not the expenditure on expenditure items or operational items. So that's a little bit of a misdemeanor offence. But I think we're in a tight spot, partly of our own making with strikes and the like. And under these circumstances, I think he's come up quite okay. But the room to maneuver in South Africa is getting far, far fewer. So I think we're going to see a lot of the sort of capital spend from state-owned enterprises like the SAA having to be privatized first before we can see that change. But that's obviously not part that's not going to be set in a budget, but that is probably on the horizon in the next government's, maybe in year 3 or 4, that we'll have to look at that.
Well, you mentioned strikes, and apart from not being brave enough with tax reform for small businesses, the DA said he failed to address labour instability and the cost of doing business in South Africa. Is that something you'd have liked to have heard more about, Emil?
He did mention, if you also look at the subsequent interview with him, he did mention that, and he said, yes, both parties must come to the discussion, to the table. And he mentioned that there's so much more that he can do as a Minister of Finance, I think. It's quite important, and he also indicated, yes, change from I want something as opposed to I need something. And that's really the message that he sent, and it's quite important from that perspective.
Let's leave it there, gentlemen. A pleasure chatting to you this evening. Thanks so much for your time. Mike Schisler is Chief Economist at economist.co.za. Emil Brincker is the Director at Cliffe Dekker Hofmeyr, and Rob Price is Market Strategist at ETM Analytics.
Well, do